They said justice was blind, but it sure as hell knew the color of her skin. The smack of his hand across her face was louder than the gavel ever could be, and in that moment, the courtroom became a theater where everyone chose to watch or look away. The woman's name was Lillian Price, 63 years old, mother of 2, grandmother of 4, and a woman whose life had been stitched together with the quiet dignity of endurance. She had seen her share of storms, but nothing prepared her for the sting of that officer's palm across her cheek inside a courthouse that was supposed to be the very temple of fairness. Her knees shook, not from fear, but from the shock of humiliation. Gasps rippled through the benches, but no one moved. The officer, broad-shouldered and pale-skinned with a jaw clenched in arrogance, towered over her as if daring anyone to intervene. Her hand instinctively rose to her cheek, the skin already warm and throbbing. For a heartbeat, her eyes flicked upward, catching the golden sunlight breaking through the courtroom's tall windows, as if heaven itself was forcing her to remember she was not alone. That slap was not just flesh meeting flesh. It was history echoing. It was centuries of silencing, compressed into one violent gesture. Lillian had not come here to fight. She had come as a witness in a small case about a traffic stop gone wrong. A simple matter, she thought, one she had agreed to speak on because her conscience told her truth should matter. She had sat patiently, waiting for her turn, her Bible resting in her lap. And yet, all it took was her refusal to step aside quickly enough when commanded by the officer in charge of courtroom order for everything to spiral. He barked at her like she was a stray dog, and when she moved with the stiffness of age instead of the swiftness of obedience, his hand lashed out. A slap in front of the judge, in front of jurors, in front of America's grand idea of justice. But no gavel struck, no judge spoke, no one moved. The silence was a verdict in itself. Her lips trembled, but not a single tear fell. She would not give them the satisfaction. She steadied herself against the railing, her body fragile, but her spirit screaming. And then, just as the air grew heavy with complicity, the door at the far end of the courtroom swung open. The man who stepped in was Malcolm Price, her son. He wore the dark navy suit of a federal prosecutor, his badge gleaming faintly at his belt. 38 years old, tall with the kind of posture that made people listen before he even spoke. His eyes scanned the room in a single sweep, and when they landed on his mother's bruised face, something inside him cracked. The courtroom, once a place where whispers dared not echo, now felt like a volcano holding back its eruption. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He did not shout. He did not rush. Instead, he walked forward with the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. Every click of his polished shoes against the marble floor was a countdown, and everyone in the room knew something had shifted. The officer's smirk faltered, just slightly, enough for Lillian to see it and draw strength from it. She had raised her son to be a man of law, a man of reason, a man who believed in justice even when it broke her heart to admit justice rarely believed in them. Malcolm reached her side and placed his hand lightly on her shoulder. The touch was tender, steadying, a silent promise that she was no longer alone in this room of wolves. He looked at the officer, and the silence turned sharp, like a blade waiting to slice through hypocrisy. But before words could fly, let us go back to what brought them here. Because this story was never about one slap. It was about the 1,000 invisible ones that had come before. Lillian had grown up in Alabama in the late 60s, when fire hoses tore through streets and little black girls were killed in churches. She carried that memory like a scar, though she never let her children see how deep it ran. She cooked, she prayed, she worked 3 jobs, and she told her son and daughter that education would be their way out. She told Malcolm that the law could be a shield if you knew how to hold it. And he believed her. He studied harder than most, went to college on scholarships, then law school, then the Justice Department. He became the man prosecutors wanted on their side because he could dismantle a case with precision. But beneath his sharp mind was a boy who had watched his mother be stopped, searched, and humiliated more times than he could count. A boy who promised himself he would never be silent if injustice stood before him. And now, here it was, slapping his mother in front of the very system he swore to defend. Malcolm's voice finally cut the air. Low, controlled, but carrying the gravity of truth. Did you just assault a 63-year-old woman in this courtroom? No one breathed. The officer shifted, his authority suddenly fragile under the scrutiny of a federal prosecutor whose badge carried more weight than his uniform. The judge, red-faced and trembling, adjusted his glasses as if unsure whether to intervene or hide behind procedure. Lillian, her voice hoarse yet steady, whispered just loud enough for her son to hear, "Don't lose yourself, baby. Remember who you are." But Malcolm's eyes burned. He remembered exactly who he was. The tension thickened, the golden light cutting across the courtroom floor like lines drawn in history, one side of silence, one side of reckoning. This was not just about his mother. This was about every mother who had been struck, silenced, dismissed, and every son who had to choose between rage and justice. And Malcolm Price, federal prosecutor, was not about to choose quietly. Malcolm did not raise his voice, but the weight in his tone pressed against every wall of that room. "Answer the question, officer. Did you strike this woman?" His words were not a request. They were a demand, wrapped in the authority of federal law and the fury of a son whose patience was at its breaking point. The officer blinked, his lips curling into a half-sneer, half-smirk. "She was noncompliant. I acted within protocol." His voice carried the casual arrogance of a man too accustomed to hiding behind the shield of his badge. But in that moment, his badge felt like paper against the steel of Malcolm's presence. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Some jurors dropped their gaze, as if ashamed to have witnessed what they could not justify. The judge fiddled with his pen, his robe suddenly heavy on his shoulders. And Lillian stood taller than she had just minutes before, her back straightening under the quiet strength of her son's arrival. Malcolm's lips tightened. "Protocol? Since when does protocol allow striking a 63-year-old woman who posed no threat? Since when does protocol become a license for humiliation?" The silence answered for him. Lillian's hand still rested on the wooden rail, her fingers trembling. She whispered, "Malcolm, please don't." Her plea was not to stop him, but to protect him from the cost of standing up in a place where speaking truth carried consequences. She had lived long enough to know how quickly power retaliates. But Malcolm shook his head gently, his eyes never leaving the officer. "No, Mama. Not today." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I want this on record. A sworn officer of the court just committed battery on a civilian, in full view of witnesses. If this courtroom ignores it, then this courtroom becomes complicit." His words struck harder than any gavel. The judge cleared his throat, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Price, this is highly irregular. You are not counsel in this case." Malcolm's jaw flexed. "Irregular? What's irregular, Your Honor, is an officer striking a witness and facing no immediate consequence. What's irregular is silence in the face of violence. You may not have invited me into this case, but the law doesn't stop at your invitation." Gasps echoed again. The gallery, once frozen, now stirred with murmurs of outrage. A woman in the back whispered, "He's right," while another man muttered, "This is going to get messy." The officer shifted his weight, suddenly aware that the shield of silence he relied on was cracking. "You don't know the full story, prosecutor." She was resisting. Resisting what? Malcolm's voice sharpened. Resisting gravity? Resisting age? Resisting the indignity of being ordered around like property. He took one step closer, his height eclipsing the officer's bravado. The only thing she resisted was surrendering her dignity. And you punished her for it. For the first time, the officer faltered. His eyes darted to the judge, seeking rescue. But the judge, sensing the air had shifted beyond his control, remained silent. Malcolm inhaled slowly, steadying himself. His anger was a fire, but he knew fire could consume as easily as it could illuminate. He thought of his mother's voice whispering years ago, when he was a boy sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks. "The law can be your sword, baby, but never forget it can cut you too." He straightened. "Your Honor, I move for this officer to be removed from the courtroom immediately pending investigation. If you deny that, then I will personally file a federal civil rights complaint before this day ends. And I will not stop there." The judge's hand trembled as he adjusted his glasses again. He looked at Malcolm, then at Lillian, then at the officer whose confidence had drained into pale discomfort. The weight of history pressed down on the room, a reminder that moments like these were recorded not just in transcripts, but in the conscience of a nation. Finally, the judge exhaled. "Officer, step out of this courtroom." The officer froze. "But Your Honor, step out." the judge repeated, his voice firmer, though it wavered under the enormity of the decision. The officer's jaw clenched, but he obeyed, marching stiffly toward the exit. Each step echoed like the retreat of a collapsing wall. The gallery watched in stunned silence as the door shut behind him. For the first time since the slap, Lillian allowed herself to breathe. Her shoulders eased, though her cheeks still burned. Malcolm turned to her, his eyes softening. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly, though the truth was written on her skin. "I'll live," she said, her voice carrying both weariness and pride. Malcolm's chest tightened. He wanted to cradle her, shield her, undo the harm. But he also knew that her survival was not the same as justice. The judge cleared his throat again. "Mr. Price, this courtroom will recess for 15 minutes. He banged his gavel, though it sounded weaker than ever before. As people shuffled, whispers grew into a storm. Some condemned the officer. Others muttered that Malcolm had gone too far. But beneath it all was the undeniable truth. Something had cracked open in that room, and it could not be sealed again. Malcolm guided his mother to a bench in the hallway. The sunlight followed them, spilling through high windows, wrapping them in gold. It was as if the world wanted her dignity restored in light, even if justice was still on trial. Lillian sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You shouldn't have risked your career like that," she whispered. Malcolm crouched in front of her, his voice low, intimate. "Mama, what good is my career if I can't defend the woman who gave it to me? You taught me the law was supposed to mean something. You taught me to fight clean, but to fight. Today was not about my badge. It was about you." Her eyes shimmered, tears threatening to spill. "Baby, I just don't want the world to take you the way it takes so many of our men. You think the law will shield you, but I've seen it turn on us before." Malcolm clasped her hands gently. "Then let it turn. I'll face it head on. Because if we don't fight here, then every slap yours, mine, theirs becomes the silence of tomorrow." The words hung between them, heavy and luminous. But neither of them knew that the slap, that moment, would ignite a chain of events larger than either could have foreseen. Journalists, already sniffing around the courthouse for a mundane traffic case, had caught wind of the confrontation. Cameras began to gather outside, and whispers of a federal prosecutor confronting racism in open court started weaving into headlines. Inside, the judge wrestled with fear. He knew the world outside those walls was about to learn what happened inside them, and no robe was thick enough to protect him from the storm. Malcolm, though, sat quietly by his mother, steadying her trembling hand, unaware that the fight he had just begun was only the beginning. Because the system does not break from one slap. It resists. It retaliates. And it was about to test just how far Malcolm Price was willing to go for justice. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed like a hive that had just been kicked. Word traveled fast inside courthouses, faster than law, faster than reason. Clerks whispered in corners, attorneys poked their heads out of office doors, and security guards tightened their grips on radios. The slap had become more than a strike on one woman's facade, was now a rupture threatening to spill out into the streets. Malcolm sat beside his mother on the wooden bench, the golden afternoon light streaming through tall windows, bathing them both in a strange serenity. Lillian's hand still trembled in his. She had survived segregation, marches, boycotts, and indignities too countless to name. Yet nothing shook her like watching her son confront the system she had warned him about his entire life. "Baby, they won't forget this," she murmured, her voice quiet but firm. "You shamed them in their own house." Malcolm tightened his jaw. "If their house can't stand shame, Mama, maybe it's built wrong." Her eyes softened, but behind them was the deep fatigue of a woman who had seen too many fights drag the best of men into graves or prisons. "You think truth will carry you. But truth is heavy, son. Sometimes too heavy." Before he could answer, the sharp click of heels cut across the hall. A woman approached a reporter, judging by the notepad clutched in her hand and the restless energy in her stride. She was young, mid-30s, with glasses sliding down her nose and eyes that burned with curiosity. "Mr. Price," she said quickly, lowering her voice. "I'm Jessica Hall with the Tribune. Is it true? An officer struck your mother inside the courtroom?" Malcolm's body stiffened. The press was the last thing he wanted, yet perhaps the only thing the truth needed. He looked at Lillian. Her face, bruised but unbowed, met his gaze. She gave a small nod. She knew the story was no longer hers alone. Yes, Malcolm said finally, his voice deliberate. It happened. In plain sight. And if this system pretends otherwise, then every citizen in this country deserves to know. Jessica scribbled furiously. Do you plan to press charges? File complaints? This isn't about plans, Malcolm cut in. This is about principle. And the principle is simple. No badge gives the right to brutality. Not in a courthouse, not in a street, not anywhere. His words were crisp, quotable, dangerous. The kind of words that ricocheted from print to screen within hours. Jessica's eyes widened, recognizing their power. She nodded, then darted down the hall, already dialing her phone. Lillian sighed, her fingers tightening around his. Now it begins. And she was right. By the time the recess ended, the courthouse steps were crawling with cameras. Reporters jostled for angles, microphones bristling like bayonets. The story had outgrown the courtroom, spilling into headlines faster than any judge could gavel it down. Inside, the judge returned to the bench, his face pale, his composure cracked. He had seen the swarm outside. He knew the transcript of today's proceedings would not be buried in dusty archives. It would live, loud and unrelenting, in tomorrow's papers and on every news feed. Court is back in session, he announced, though his voice lacked conviction. Malcolm remained seated beside his mother, technically a spectator, but in truth the axis around which the entire room now spun. Every pair of eyes flicked toward him, waiting, weighing, fearing. The defense attorney for the traffic case cleared his throat, but the words came out thin. Your Honor, before we proceed, I believe we must address. He was cut off by the slamming open of the courtroom doors. A man in a dark suit strode in, flanked by two aides. His presence carried weight. District Attorney, clearly summoned by whispers of chaos. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing when they landed on Malcolm. Mr. Price, the DA said, his tone both cautious and confrontational. May I speak with you outside? The judge nodded quickly, eager to transfer responsibility. Malcolm rose slowly, his hand brushing his mother's shoulder in reassurance. He followed the DA into the hallway, where the buzz of reporters pressed against the building's doors like a rising tide. The DA turned sharply, his voice low and urgent. What the hell do you think you're doing? You're a federal prosecutor, not some activist with a bullhorn. You've just put your career, and mine, in jeopardy. Malcolm's eyes were steady. What I'm doing is refusing to let a crime be erased in front of me. My badge doesn't blind me. It binds me to justice, whether the perpetrator wears a hoodie or a uniform. The DA scowled. You think headlines will protect you? They won't. You embarrassed an officer, embarrassed a judge. The system closes ranks when threatened. Do you want to be the nail sticking up when the hammer swings? Malcolm's lips curved into the faintest trace of a bitter smile. Maybe the problem is we keep worrying about hammers instead of fixing the damn wood. The DA exhaled sharply, his frustration boiling. I'm telling you this as a colleague. Step back. Let internal affairs handle it quietly. If you push, you'll ignite something you can't control. But Malcolm shook his head. That officer's hand struck more than my mother's face. It struck every promise we've made as a nation. And I won't let internal affairs bury that in paperwork. The DA studied him for a long moment, then muttered, God help you, Price. Because no one else will. He turned and walked away, leaving Malcolm alone with the rising murmur of the crowd outside. When he re-entered the courtroom, the air was thicker than before. The judge avoided his eyes, the jurors restless, the gallery humming with unease. Lillian sat where he left her, her chin lifted, dignity stitched into every line of her face. And Malcolm realized, this was no longer about a slap, or even about one officer. It was about whether truth could survive in the very room built to protect it. He leaned close to his mother and whispered, whatever happens next, we hold the line. She nodded softly. Then hold it, son. Hold it tight. Outside, the chants began. Protesters, alerted by headlines, gathered on the courthouse steps. Their voices rose, weaving through the walls, pressing into the courtroom itself. Justice for Lillian. Justice now. The slap had awakened something larger, and neither judge, nor officer, nor DA could contain it. And Malcolm Price, federal prosecutor, son, witness to injustice, understood that his fight had only just begun. The protests had swelled beyond what anyone expected. What began with a handful of voices on the courthouse steps grew into hundreds, then thousands. Their chants rose like thunder, echoing against stone walls, carried by the evening air across the city. Signs lifted, fists raised, and the story of Lillian Price, the 63-year-old black woman struck by a police officer in open court, burned across television screens and headlines nationwide. But with every chant came a shadow. Threats whispered into Malcolm's voicemail. Anonymous letters slipped under his office door. Warnings disguised as advice from colleagues who once praised his discipline now accused him of betrayal. The system he served for years had turned cold, brittle, calculating. Still, Malcolm pressed on. He filed the complaint. He demanded the officer's arrest. He stood at press conferences beside his mother, his words sharp but resolute. We do not ask for special treatment. We demand equal protection. No badge, no robe, no gavel should outweigh the dignity of a human being. The city trembled with tension. Police unions staged their own rallies, painting Malcolm as a traitor. Commentators on television debated whether he was a hero or a reckless agitator. But beneath the noise, something undeniable stirred a recognition that what happened to Lillian was not an isolated crack in the system, but a fracture running through its foundation. One evening, as protests filled the streets, Malcolm sat with his mother at her kitchen table. The same table where decades earlier she had taught him multiplication, scripture, and the stubborn hope that learning could change their lives. You're tired, Lillian said softly, studying her son's weary face. Malcolm rubbed his temples. I'm fine. No, baby, she insisted, her voice tender but firm. You're carrying more than one man can carry. He looked at her, at the bruise that had faded but not disappeared. I just keep hearing it, Mama. That sound. His hand on your face. And the silence afterward. That silence is louder than the slap. She reached across the table, her hand resting over his. Then you fill it, Malcolm. With truth. With courage. With something louder than their silence. That's what you've been doing. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening with the weight of both love and grief. But what if it costs us everything? My job, your safety, she smiled faintly, a weary but radiant smile. Baby, we've been paying costs our whole lives. At least this time, the price means something. The next morning, Malcolm walked into federal court not as a prosecutor, not as a son, but as a man willing to put everything on the line. Cameras flashed. Protesters cheered. Opponents scowled. The air hummed with history. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The officer who had struck his mother sat stiffly at the defense table, his attorney whispering frantically. The judge looked older, smaller, as though the robe could no longer shield him from the world outside. Malcolm rose, his voice steady. This is not a trial about one officer and one woman. This is a trial about the promises we make as a nation. Do we mean it when we say all are equal before the law? Or are those words just paint on parchment, fading with every act of silence? He paused, scanning the room. Jurors shifted, their eyes fixed on him. Reporters scribbled. His mother sat in the gallery, her chin high, her spirit unbroken. My mother was struck not because she was a threat, but because she was seen as less, Malcolm continued. Less deserving of respect, less deserving of patience, less deserving of humanity. But she is not less. And neither is any person who has ever stood where she stood. This case is not about punishing one hand. It is about stopping a pattern that has bruised generations. The silence that followed was not the silence of complicity. It was the silence of reckoning. Days passed. Testimonies unraveled. Witnesses admitted what they saw. The defense tried to twist facts, to paint Lillian as unruly, difficult, even dangerous. But every attempt collapsed under the weight of truth. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty. The officer was found guilty of assault under color of law. It was a rare outcome, almost unheard of. But it was real. Lillian exhaled, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Malcolm squeezed her hand, his heart pounding with both triumph and sorrow. He knew this one victory would not erase centuries of injustice. But it was a crack in the wall, and cracks could spread. Outside, the crowd erupted. Chants of justice for Lillian rose into the golden evening sky. Strangers embraced. Children perched on parents' shoulders, their eyes wide with hope. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, questions flying. But Malcolm held his mother close and said only one thing. Today we prove that silence can be broken. Tomorrow, we keep breaking it. As the sun dipped low, casting the courthouse in a warm glow, Lillian looked up at her son. "You held the line," she whispered. Malcolm smiled through tears. "No, Mama. We held it together." And in that golden light, bruises and all, they stood not just as mother and son, but as proof that dignity, once defended, could never be erased. Because the slap was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of theirs. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.